Thank you, Father Mark, and welcome again to everyone. I would once again like to extend our gratitude to Father Dave Kelly for celebrating Mass with us. A few notes on Father Kelly. Father Dave is a member of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood Order, and many of his brothers are here with him today. And Precious Blood are one of 24 men's religious orders that govern CTU. Father Dave is also an inspiring graduate of CTU, as he mentioned, with both an MDiv and a DMin from CTU. And a classmate of Father Mark Francis. This just in. Father Dave is the executive director of the Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, PBMR, and that's in the back of the Yards neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. He was ordained in 1982 and since then has devoted his entire ministry to working with incarcerated people whose lives and communities have been harmed by the criminal justice system, and victims of violence more broadly. Since 2002, PBMR has worked with neighbors and community stakeholders in the back of the Yards to facilitate community-based and community-led approaches to healing and relationship building. They specialize in building community trust and respect through restorative justice peacemaking circles. These peace circles are also a primary means to address the causes and heal the harms of violence. In the last 10 years, Father Dave has helped to develop the citywide network of community restorative justice hubs in neighborhoods spanning the south and west sides of Chicago. Thank you for being with us, Father Dave. Now, before I introduce the rest of the panel, I have to do a plug for Catholic Theological Union. So as many of you know, CTU is a Roman Catholic graduate school of theology and ministry. As an intercultural community of faith and learning, we bring the richness of the Roman Catholic tradition, teaching and practice to our students and alumni, to the broader church, and to the public through programs like today's Sunday at CTU, our lecture and liturgy series. We're delighted that you're here with us for this event. I'd like to especially thank our host committee, CTU faculty members Dr. Malka Simkovich, our Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies, Scott Alexander, our Director of the Catholic Muslim Studies Program, and two special alumni who are here, Eileen O'Farrell-Smith and Susan Pudelic, who are both involved in interfaith ministry. We are known here at CTU for our distinguished faculty. Our faculty has engaged in programs since 1968, and those programs have expanded to address the intercultural needs of the church in an increasingly global society, including the Catholic Jewish Studies Program, the Catholic Muslim Studies Program, Hispanic Theology and Ministry Program, and Black Theology and Ministry Program. CTU has over 4,500 laymen and women and vowed religious graduates, many still serving in ministry settings within 60 countries worldwide. Whether you are here for the very first time or longtime supporters, welcome. It is my great pleasure to welcome our panelists this afternoon, Phil Andrew, Jane Charney, and Shamar Hemphill. Our fourth panelist, Reverend Dr. B. Herbert Martin, was sadly unable to join us today. Phil Andrew leads the Archdiocese of Chicago's violence prevention initiatives, where he is responsible for all aspects of safety, programs, and partnerships. He is also an adjunct instructor of negotiation, business intelligence, and leadership at DePaul University in their business school. Prior to joining the Archdiocese in 2018, Phil spent over 20 years as a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as an instructor at the FBI Academy in crisis management, negotiation, behavior analysis, and undercover investigations. He is a graduate of DePaul University College of Law and the University of Illinois. Welcome, Phil. Jane Charney is the Director of Domestic Affairs at the Jewish Community Relations Council. She previously served as the Assistant Regional Director of AJC Chicago, where her portfolio focused on building lasting relationships with leaders in Chicago's ethnic, religious, and diplomatic communities. Jane holds a BA in journalism and international studies from Indiana University and a master's in international relations with a focus on nationalism from the University of Chicago. Born in Moscow, Jane came to the US with her family as a teenager. In addition to English, Jane speaks Russian, Spanish, and French. Jane and her husband live in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood with their 2 young children. Bienvenue. And Shamar Hemphill. Shamar is our trifecta here at CTU. He is a student, he is an instructor, and he is now a director of a nascent program that's happening here called Muslim, which he can actually maybe talk about a little bit further, through our Catholic Muslim Studies program. He brings with him vast experience in the areas of civic engagement, community organizing, and youth development. Born on the south side of Chicago, he attended Langston University and studied sociology. Upon his return to Chicago, he took a position at the Mosque Foundation as youth coordinator, working with both Arab and African American Muslim youth. In 2007, Shamar was recruited to participate in Public Allies, a leadership development program started by Michelle Obama. After graduating from Public Allies, Shamar began working for the Inner City Muslim Action Network as coordinator for the organization's youth department, where he's worked in low-income neighborhoods throughout the Chicagoland area, both as an organizer and an adult ally to young people. Shamar is no stranger to CTU, as I mentioned, and we will also, IMAN is a very important partner to CTU, and we will be recognizing its executive director at our graduation this coming May with an honorary degree offered to Rami Nashashibi. So with that, I welcome our panel.
Well, the problem is they gave me 2 electronic devices, and so that's never going to work. So nonetheless, I'm going to give this a shot. So we have some slides. I hope you all can see this to kind of just set the context, but kind of a disclaimer. I think statistics don't always tell the full story. Or let me put it that way. Statistics do not tell the full story. But they might help us with a little bit of a context to what we're talking about here in regards to violence in Chicago. So if I can do this, you have them over there and over here. What we're experiencing today is violence coming down in Chicago. A lot of people perhaps are taking some credit for that. Before Charlie Beck became the acting superintendent, the police took a lot of credit for the new technology, which is a part of that. Shamar and I are part of an organization collaborative called CPPS, Communities Partnering for Peace, in which we really emphasize and stress outreach workers, which is really folks, credible messengers, if you will, who go out on the streets and engage and build relationships with young people who are in danger of being harmed or in danger of harming folks. Plus, there's just a lot of other kinds of things that are being brought to bear on this that can be causes, all of them are causes for, right now at least, violence by guns are coming down a little bit. Other kinds of violence, not so much. So you can see the statistics here a little bit on throughout the years, that there was a real peak in 2016 where really Chicago made national news and continues to make national news. Since then, little by little, things have been coming down a little bit in regards to homicides and shooting victims. So we're on a path, we're hopeful, where things are beginning to work out. The big fear for all of us who work in this area is that we don't take our eye off the ball. That somehow we kind of sit back and relax because the trends are coming in a way that are favorable to those of us who are working in the neighborhoods. There we go. So again, you can see the various the crime statistics, how they have peaked in other cities. So they've compared Chicago oftentimes to New York and LA, although I'm not sure that comparison is completely accurate in the sense that they're different cities. And one of the things that we always recognize, even in our neighborhoods, that neighborhoods are different. And so sometimes the response has to be different. But nonetheless, where other neighborhoods have, the trend is coming down, Chicago peaked in 2016, and only now we're starting to get a lesser amount of violence due to gun violence and shootings. One of the things I might say in this area is that a group of folks went out to LA and New York to listen to them and see what worked in LA and New York, and we're starting to use some of those learnings here in Chicago. And one of the big learnings was the relationship between police and communities, and how outreach workers no longer are looked as with suspect necessarily by the police, but rather the police are starting to engage and appreciate the work of outreach workers. And outreach workers in kind are seeing that the police have a role to play. And we're very careful that those are two separate roles. Each have their two separate roles in the work of nonviolence. So these are just other statistics that show that the number of shootings from Chicago. And then the other thing is we recognize as we look at this data that shootings, violence, oftentimes happen at particular times and days of the week and hours. And so the summer months tend to be, because everybody's out and everybody's milling about, those tend to have some peaks in violence, as well as weekends, especially Friday and Saturday nights. So in turn, our outreach workers are out there more in the later hours of the Saturday and Sunday, so we respond to what we have come to know through the statistics. We know that black and brown young people, in particular males, are most at risk. So people often ask me, as an older white guy in the neighborhood, you know, don't you feel that you're at risk? Are you afraid? And what I say to a lot of folk is, people like myself are not the ones at risk. Oftentimes it's the younger black and brown young people that are most at risk of violence. Equally, and perhaps relatedly, we also lock up brown and black young people at an alarming rate. And so some of those correlations might be worth studying. Males are far more likely to be a victim of violence and also to cause harm, although more and more women are caught up in that. And one of the fastest growing populations in prisons is our women. And the age, as we might understand, you get older like myself, you're no longer really out there in those streets. And so the young from we're really saying 18 to 24, 26, that age group is the ones that are most likely to be victims of violence and perhaps even cause violence. So I say all that, although I'm reluctant to start with statistics because I don't think they tell the story. I think there are a lot of things that attribute to the violence perhaps coming in our favor, going down a bit. Policing, outreach workers, some would say that on the south side of Chicago we have UC Trauma Center, and so people, homicide victims, perhaps that has a causation as well. But I'm thrilled to have this panel to help us understand more fully what's happening in Chicago and some of the responses, what's working and perhaps what's not working. So I'm going to ask, so my job is pretty much just ask the questions, which is a wonderful place to be. So I'm going to ask each of them to kind of speak on their own about who you are, the organization that you represent, and how perhaps your faith has an impact in the work that you're doing. So who are you? You know, what is your organization? What is it about? And then how your faith has an impact in this kind of work. And I'll ask Phil, maybe he can start. I hope that thing's not lit. You can't go up here.
Okay, how's that?
Good. I'll stay away from it.
It's Phil Andrew again, and thank you, Father, and thank you for that Mass. I thought you framed this beautifully during that. For those that are there, I think we're kind of filling in the holes and putting out the 3 action items, and maybe you guys can write some checks. Because I think we got the inspiration piece. So I come to this obviously with a little bit different vantage point. I've got 21 years in the FBI. Most of that in responding to crises. My role in the FBI really had me responding to people in their worst moments. Folks that had either barricaded themselves and were personally in crisis, or folks that were being arrested and it was really the worst day of their life. And recognizing that you were meeting people in crisis was very sort of informative. Now, crisis seems to have followed me. I'm one of 7 children. a big Catholic family from the north side. It was an idyllic childhood, but just 7 kids in one house had a lot of controversy and conflict. So I feel like I learned a lot about crisis growing up, and some of the skills I learned in responding to crisis weren't actually that effective. I was very active in sports and sometimes practiced some of those sports with my brothers in the kitchen, to my mother's dismay. But another point sort of defined my relationship with violence early on. In 1988, Gwinnett, Illinois experienced America's first school shooting. And there's a lot we should have learned from that event that we are still learning, sadly, as a nation. But that we've got a problem in this country with the easy access to dangerous firearms. And that shouldn't be a shock to anybody here, that that's something as a policy issue that we've got to grapple with and we've got to fix. And frankly, it's an easy thing to fix if we just do what we say we already want. Okay? So, thank you. So my lens on this is really about crisis, and I'll tell you what, you'll hear the overlapping themes here of both having somebody that's actually gone through a few crises and responded to people in crisis, and you'll see the themes lead out here, is that the first thing somebody needs when they experience a crisis is they need physical safety. People need to be removed from it. In your own experience, whether it's an accident, it's something violent, it's a medical crisis, the first thing people need is physical safety. And then the next thing they need is some emotional safety. They need to know that people care, and they need to know that they can connect with someone non-judgmentally. So that's the framework that I approach this from, and I can't help but see the commonality of responding to our national crisis with violence in schools and the national crisis that we have in certain cities, and particularly in certain neighborhoods in certain cities, that we have people in crisis that need to be responded to. And the theme of getting close to that, proximity, the Holy Father, the Pope talks about this notion of us being the field hospital. And I think that's actually like an affirmative action item. This isn't some sort of platitude that we should think about helping people, but to make a difference with people in the crisis, you've got to get close to them, and you've got to put the hand on their wound, and you've got to stop the bleeding. And if you take that metaphor to the emotional, the trauma, the needing job training, the needing accompaniment, you start seeing how that really makes sense. And you'll see that as these programs are described, those are the components that they have, the effective, successful programs that we are deploying in Chicago, that we've learned from some other jurisdictions, but in truth, we've always had them, but they've been anemic. You know, we haven't resourced them the way they need to be. But you'll see the themes are, it requires relationship. And it requires a relationship really based on love, to get to your point about faith, that resources, real resources follow. Because I'll tell you, you can show up and you can love me in a crisis, but I'm going to figure out that there's nothing you can do for me. And then that brings a hopelessness. But if you show up with love and a resource, then we really are bonded, and lives start changing.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. So I work for the Jewish Federation, and we are the central address of the Jewish community in Chicago. So we are first and foremost a network of social service agencies, and we cover about, I want to say 26 of the 50 wards, serve about 500,000 Chicagoans of all faiths throughout the city and the suburbs. And so first and foremost, when we look at issues related to gun violence in Chicago proper and national issues related to violence, and as Phil said, kind of the two run in parallel often. It's looking through a social service lens and looking through it at it through a Jewish social service lens. So what does that mean? For us, our Jewish tradition teaches us that saving a life is paramount, right? We say that a person who kills one person it's as if he has destroyed the universe. And a person who saves one life, it's as if he has upheld the universe, right? So it doesn't mean that saving life is just about Jewish life, right? It means all life, because as a Jew, I believe that all of us are created B'Tselem Elohim in Hebrew, and that means in the image of God, right? So the idea that I see a human, not the other, but another, a person, extends to the way that we're treating folks who are experiencing violence. And are we able to then see them holistically, see them as a person who's experiencing a set of problems that whether they're the victim or the perpetrator, the violence itself isn't the disease. It's a symptom of one. So, for example, in practical terms, this means that some of our social service agencies are the first line of defense for folks experiencing violence. Let's face it, geographically, the Jewish community doesn't live in most of the neighborhoods that are more where violence happens, right? Once in a while, you'll hear something happening in Rogers Park, for example, or in Skokie, but in reality, most of our violence is concentrated in the south and west sides of Chicago, which are historically disinvested communities, ones that are experiencing violence because it is kind of the point of a larger set of issues that have narrowed into this one particular solution that people see for themselves because they have no other resources. But because we serve 500,000 Chicagoans throughout the Chicago area, we end up seeing folks experiencing these effects of neighborhood violence. One great example is Sinai Health System. Right? Sinai is in North Lawndale. It's the level 1 trauma care center for the West Side. It is in an area that used to be a very Jewish one. It was the center of Jewish Chicago from the first half of 20th century. And Sinai Hospital itself was founded about 100 years ago as a teaching hospital for Jewish doctors at a time when there were quotas for Jews for certain professions. Right? Law firms wouldn't hire Jews, hospitals wouldn't hire Jews, other institutions wouldn't hire Jewish people, so we had to fend for ourselves and founded a hospital. Then in the 50s, when the community moved to Skokie, to Highland Park, to Rogers Park, right, was there a reason to close the hospital? No, right? We're still serving the folks in the neighborhood because that is part of our faith tradition and it is part of our social service tradition. And I want to just talk a little bit about kind of the Sinai Health System's approach, because it's a holistic approach, right? They're seeing, obviously, the gunshot victim in the hospital. They're also seeing their family. And if you look at the statistics, we're looking at kids who grow up knowing, on the south and west side of Chicago, 1 in 2 children knows somebody who's been shot and killed, or just shot in general, right? That's a staggering number. Right? It's a staggering statistic by itself, but it's a staggering just face of humanity that we have as a city, as a society, have allowed this to happen. And so there's the Sinai Health System has transitioned to kind of a more holistic approach to the person, to treating the family trauma, to figuring out what kind of resources does this person experiencing violence need, right? Do they need psychological counseling? Do they need job training? Do they need housing? Do they need transportation, right? Because they may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply because they were not able to get to where they needed to go. So I think that is a direct effect of looking at folks experiencing violence as humans first and foremost, and therefore created in the image of God.
Peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you again for allowing me to grace your presence after Mass. I'm sorry I missed Mass. I'm pretty sure it was a beautiful one. So I'll try to get here next time. I am married. I live on the south side. I have a 6-year-old daughter who's turning 60. So I know how to practice nonviolence really well. That's my spill into the work of violence. It's my 6-year-old. Now I come from the south side of Chicago, Inglewood, Backward Yards community. grew up historically, man. My family was in the midst of one of the street organizations by the name of the Black Peace Stone Rangers, and my family was in it. I never really what they proclaim as gang bang, but I was all up in it. My uncles, my cousins, my fathers, my brother, and we, historically come from a single parent household. My father was in and out of prison majority of my life, and street organizations became safe haven for. And that's the common theme in most of the neighborhoods on the south and west side. Is when you look at what originally street organizations kind of formed to really become a protection in the neighborhood. And then we can go into a whole history on the war on drugs and how all of that really kind of helped to change the dynamics of these neighborhoods in the conditions of them to this day. I come from a single parent home, youngest of 4. I myself love sports as well. I mean, sports saved my life. Sports was something that kept me out of the mix. Sports was something that made my family believe that I can achieve education and push me towards that the best way they know how. Had a lot of mentors who were in the midst of it, in the thick of it, really every day protecting me from having to be pulled into the gang itself, and really trying to provide love and support. I had, my house was like a form of a Jane Addams Whole House. At any given day, you see over 20 latchkey kids at our house living, eating up all the food. As you can imagine, people hiding food. I never slept in my bed, always had to share, learning interpersonal skills. All the great things in life that you get that you thought you would get at a school, you got at home. So I learned to share when I didn't want to very quickly. And I think violence really became a real thing for me as I was getting ready to go off to college. And my friend was transitioning. He had started to gangbang. He was over my house every day. We would play video games. He was like one of 15 of my friends that would be over. And I started to see the transition of him and the lifestyle. And our lives started to go 2 separate ways. And my brother was saying, hey, listen, you need to back up away from him. Stop hanging around him. He's changing. And I'm like, he's my best friend. What are you talking about? When I went off to school my freshman year, unfortunately, you get the news, okay, he shot 1 person, he shot 3 people, he shot 5 people, and ended up going to jail and getting 55 years in prison. Yeah. And that for me was a real reality of feeling like being, it was still tragedy for me because I was away at school. I went to Oklahoma, of all places, Langston University. Don't ask me why. I chose Langston University to go to Oklahoma. And I just felt like I was missing a lot. I felt like I was not being home. My mom was diagnosed with cancer. That she had operation the day I left for school. So I was just so like distraught around how the dynamics of my childhood friends, the neighborhoods were changing, and I wanted to be back. But the goal of me, pursuing education and making a life for myself, I owe a lot of that credit to the same neighborhood that we deem as problematic, that forced me to really try to turn into a new trajectory. And in that transition period, I became Muslim. Because even with the Black Peace Stones, when you learn about the history of that street organization, it has a very, very strange affiliation to Islam, right? So you can see guys setting up their meetings and starting their meetings with the chapter of the Quran called Al-Fatiha, what is called the opener, and then they would go off into the drug sales and they would talk about what territories need to be occupied. So it was a strange relationship to faith. And so eventually I would begin to make that transition. And for me, carrying my reality so much with me everywhere I went, I wanted to make sure I wasn't one of those ones that left and never came back, never to be proximate to the neighborhood that I was from, never to be proximate to my friends who didn't get the ability to be able to travel and go to school and see other things. And I told myself that I wouldn't be that person. And the beautiful thing in our tradition is, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, always, stated that when one part of the body hurts, all parts of the body hurt. And I felt like I still was hurting, that we had to do something. Something had to take place. I started to see my mom moving a lot, and I started to see my family have to become disbanded, and we were losing touch with the core of what community really was. And that's what really led me into the work. IMAN in 1997 incorporated and really was operating during a shift of the American Muslim community in Chicago, where communities like South Shore, back in the yards in Inglewood, where you had a lot of Muslim presence, and then you had a lot of refugee families coming from Palestine, Jordan, into the southwest side in the larger Marquette Park area, where IMAN sits and formulated its headquarters. And for me, I knew that I wanted to be a part of an effort that was really looking at not only changing the conditions of the neighborhood, but really building a real mechanism. And for the first time, we hadn't had, as a Muslim community, any real non-for-profit institutions that really demonstrated the viability of our faith. And so IMAN incorporated, and our mission is health, wellness, and healing. This notion of really bringing together, our flagship services, our health center. This just became a designated federally qualified health center last year, one of 17 across the country, that operates 6 days a week, behavioral health, dental, primary care. We have a very well-known program called Pre-Reentry that's catching a lot of steam across the country, that focuses in on both 18 to 24, but also returning citizens who have done up to 13 to 27 to 35 years in prison, coming back home, learning the trades around HVAC, carpentry, and electric. And in Atlanta, we have a chapter where they're learning plumbing. It's the full wraparound services from housing support to behavioral health support to a year-long program of learning the trades, getting placed into jobs, and in rehabbing in the same communities that they themselves felt like that they created devastation, to take abandoned buildings and rehab them using green methods. We've already done 10 units. We're on our way of doing a multi-use development along with the first social enterprise of its kind of a corner store slash, I'm losing it, a cooperative that is really looking at the idea of space usage and transformation of neighborhoods, building the ecosystem, and doing that with those who directly come from the community. Oftentimes we talk about violence and isolation, but in order to really change the conditions, you have to build up infrastructure. So doing that with the very same population, we've already graduated over hundreds of both young people and returning citizens. And it's a very, very powerful program. We do a lot of community organizing and advocacy around food justice and criminal justice. We passed one of the most critical parole reform bills in 2016. We do everything around police accountability right now in the midst of trying to pass an ordinance for the first time in the city's history. Pray for that. That's been a long fight. And then, of course, we use arts and culture as a way to kind of heal, right? To bring communities together and really use that in a number of ways. And with this same population, you'll be able to see the power of using arts as a way to heal, and the first time talking about their relationship with their mothers, the relationship with themselves, and not seeing each other as the other and the enemy or the opposition, but beginning to see each other as brothers and sisters. So that's us.
Thank you all very much. So, we hear a lot in the media about what the issues are, what the drivers of violence are. We hear a lot about gangs and gang violence and all those kinds of things. So, briefly, because our time is running, I'm not sure where the person is with the hook, but briefly, what are some of the drivers of this, of what's going on in our neighborhoods? And then more importantly, what are some of the solutions? So maybe, Phil, you can start that, because you get around the city, a lot of different organizations, schools, and things. What are some of, from your perspective, some of the drivers of this? And then, more importantly, though, some of the things you've seen that are working.
Sure. One of the key drivers is disconnectedness. Disconnectedness from the economy, disconnectedness from the community, disconnectedness from relationships. And
wherever you're finding folks that are violence affected, you're finding that. And violence tends to drive more violence. Hurt people tend to hurt. And think about somebody literally being on a physiological sprint. You are in constant crisis. You've never had a first chance. And you are going from one crisis to the next, never getting that physical safety, never finding any connection in the community, and having to navigate housing and food and even just 4 square blocks. That is just basically what we know about brain science now is that kind of trauma will form a brain that needs lots and lots of support, love, and therapy before that person's ready to take on other tasks. So what we know is working are those programs that are one very, very relationship-based. And there's really a very clear formula for this now. It requires folks to be in those communities, very, very close. It requires them to have high level of cultural competency. And it requires them to also be self-supporting so that they recognize their own limits. You can run into these very difficult circumstances thinking you're going to save the world and find yourself in a trap. And so our outreach workers are now trained in that same self-care that we ask of anybody in any industry that's difficult. That we're even trying to get some of our police officers to think about self-care. So those elements plus that piece of quality resource. And I really emphasize the quality piece because we say, yes, there might be a program nearby, but if the program didn't connect, if I didn't walk that participant over, it's like here's 9 1-800 numbers. Try to find yourself a therapist. But rather Tuesday, you and I have an appointment with a counselor that's going to help us with cognitive behavioral therapy and housing. And we're going there. I'm picking you up. We're in this together. That relationship piece, that accompaniment piece. The programs that have mastered that and then understand that they can't be everything, that we're good at the relationship piece, so I need your mental health piece. I need your jobs piece. The ones that hold themselves out and say, hey, we can do this all and not collaborate, that's the other piece. It's the folks that are really interested in hyper-level collaboration and working with other groups to deliver those great services.
Add to that, you've heard the saying, the fastest way to stop a bullet is a job, right? And so I think one of the things from there is that we know that there are community organizations working on the ground who know how to solve the issue, but for some reason, we haven't consistently put resources. We as a society, we as a city in particular, as a government entity, haven't put resources into those organizations on the ground that know the population, know the solutions. Right? And so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This is one of the reasons that in 2016, the Jewish Federation was among the first organizations to be part of a really amazing entity called the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities. It is almost 4 years later, it is a group of 40 major funders from around the city of Chicago, funding on the ground investment in infrastructure, safety infrastructure, gun violence prevention, intervention, and reduction, right? It's everything from block parties to outreach workers to engaging community resources, trying to map what is actually already in existence and putting funding toward that. One of the reasons that we became part of this is that as a community, the Jewish community understands that we are not on the ground, right? For the most part, unless you're counting some of our individual agencies, but we're not really on the ground in those neighborhoods, and we need to listen to the experts who know what they're doing and who have the solutions. And then we do have, individual Jews who are working with these programs. So one program that you may have heard about is called MASK. It's Mothers and Men Against Senseless Killings. Tamar Manasseh is a Black Jewish woman who used to live in Englewood, moved out, figured out that her neighborhood was suffering, and is since about 2016 has been having basically an outdoor community center on the corner of 75th and Stewart, a corner that had experienced a number of violent incidents. And for a while Tamar's organization has been there, hadn't, right? So what they're doing, it is basic. It is providing community, it is feeding people, it is giving kids on the block an opportunity to engage with each other, learn something, be with people like themselves, right? And yet, for some reason, this hadn't been happening in the community, and it needed a catalyst, right? So there's this woman, Shamar, who started the organization. Now it's expanded. They received part of the lot from the city, part of the lot from Cook County, and are building a block academy, which is a school training folks in vocational, various vocations, and also providing people who need it, for example, a pathway to a GED, and other ways that people can feel needed by the larger society, right? I think one of the problems we're experiencing is that when you don't have an outlet, you might turn to a street organization, you might turn to violence. And organizations like Tamar's or Institute for Nonviolence in Austin are giving people an opportunity to feel like a contributing member of society.
I'll add that a lot of us in Chicago and in these neighborhoods are doing the work, right? We're doing the work, we're building the relationships, we're building the infrastructure. We're stretching as much as we possibly can to be able to deal with these larger systemic 50, 60, 75-year-old issues. The problem, and I have to say this, the problem is that when community institutions and nonprofits have to begin to start talking about doing the work of what institutions are already set up to do, meaning that we have to spread ourselves to try to build and develop infrastructure and build buildings and be the job providers and be the economic engine in neighborhoods, we become part of the problem, right? Because the source is already that, because with that level of devastation, we're supposed to be what we're already doing. We're the accessories in the community, linking people to resources, showing them how to advocate for themselves, bringing them into networks that they're often, not being a part of, left out of conversations. When big decision makers are in the room talking about policies that they're not in the room, we're getting them in the room. We're building the hubs. We're reconciliating, our faith communities are reconciliating, and doing things that no other system can possibly do. We're doing those things. Muslims, historically in these neighborhoods, have been known as the reconciliation machine of bringing different gangs and tribes together, powerful ways that no other entity or any other kind of economic plan that America can lay out. The problem is we're left to our own demise to try to deal with these things, and we are grossly underfunded. We are grossly, removed from the wealth to be able to allow individuals like that Father Kelly has served, that many of us have mentored and many of us are working with, to try to get them back to square A. I mean, we're working at a serious deficit. Folks who really have no real viable educational opportunities. Interpersonal skills are not even met. The things that we have to deal with every day to try to get somebody in a home or to get somebody some basic resources or to remind them or force them to try to go into programs that are beneficial, that are there. We're doing that. I think that we just have to recognize that communities are being stretched right now, and we're going to need more institutions, faith institutions. We're going to need economic institutions and everybody to really deal with this massive problem. And until we are not really seeing this as our problem, we're going to be left to our own demise. And we can do it incrementally. This week we're going to announce that we want to go under 20% of shootings. We talk about LA and New York, and it's like, no, we still got some massive destruction in our neighborhoods that hasn't changed for a very long time. Those neighborhoods have been gentrified in those places. So again, and then we still have people who don't trust the work that we're doing, Father Kelly, by saying that, hey, if you all are trying to solve the problem to allow our communities to become gentrified, right? We're just waiting to be gentrified in the first place. We have to give communities hope, and it has to start from institutions like CTU.
So I think we have a little bit of time for maybe a question or two from the audience. I think that was part of the program. So if anybody has a question, I'll run with the mic.
if someone wanted to volunteer to help, where would they go? If they were Catholic, if they were Jewish, if they were Muslim, whatever, where do you go to help?
We're located on the southwest side, 63rd in California. No discrimination. You don't have to be Muslim to be a part of our base. There's many, many people who are part of the base that's doing tremendous work, who get involved in our policy initiatives, get involved in our weekly programs, forums. There's always space for you to get involved.
But give me the specific name of the entity that I should be Googling.
IMAN, Inner City Muslim Action Network.
I would recommend the nonviolence training at the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago in Austin. It is not a Jewish organization necessarily, but it is run by a Jewish man, and but also they're doing tremendous work, and they're engaging with the community in a way that I think the community has not experienced in many, many years, and it is a model based in King and nonviolence, so teaching really identifying those folks who are the most at risk of being either the perpetrator or the victim of violence, and figuring out how do we change their perspectives, how do we build an infrastructure of peace. And that involves economics, that involves transportation, that involves health and building a safety infrastructure and building community relations. And I think going that way, kind of learning the very basics and listening to the people actually doing the work is the most important thing.
A quick second to the Institute for Nonviolence, fabulous partner, and knows how to use volunteers. Catholic Charities, go to their website, go to volunteer, click it, it'll take you right there. Precious Blood Ministries of Reconciliation, go to volunteer, click it, it'll take you right there. Mercy Home has mentor programs very easily. Parenting for Nonviolence, go to their website, volunteer, take their class, sponsor an informational seminar. Go to Colby House on the Archdiocese website. Click volunteer there. They'll plug you right in and connect you. This proximate piece of getting close to it, you don't have to get out on the street by doing this, but you get close to the people doing the work and figure out how you support them. We don't need you doing street outreach. In fact, I'm going to recommend to most of this room that you may have missed your opportunity for proper training for street outreach. But for you to support a street outreach worker or provide jobs for the street outreach success that's pulled somebody into services and in 14 to 24 months has made them job ready, and take a chance on them. There are so many volunteer opportunities. You just got to think about where you plug in. You could be producing jobs. You could be the economic engine. You could be serving on these boards. You could be providing strategic advice. Figure out what you want to do. Get on those websites and get involved.
And one more plug, I think one of the important issues is that we also forget that there's another side to gun violence, and that is the advocacy part, right? So we have to figure out how to curb access to guns in general, but I think also specific types of firearms, how to make sure that police-community relationships are at the level we need them to be. So for example, in a Jewish community, the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs is a fabulous organization. They've been involved in the GAPA ordinance work since almost the very beginning as part of the broad coalition, and elevating some of these coalitions and also being part of them, right? Going to your alderman, going to other elected officials and ensuring that they hear all of the voices, right? It doesn't just mean that we need to hear the voices from folks actually experiencing violence. We need to make sure that this is the problem that the entire city is addressing, not just the folks on the south side or the folks on the west side who have continually not had a voice in city government.
I think one of the things too that's a little bit different too, in the past, non-for-profits had to compete for a limited amount of funding. And so much, and Jane, you alluded to this, with the Partner for Safer Communities, the funders came together, pooled some money together, and really supported organizations who were already doing the work and giving them the resources to do that work even more deeply. And Shamar and I are part of a CP for Communities Partnering for Peace. So whether we like it or not, we see each other all the time. And we're in meetings and things because we're collaborating. And there's other organizations, Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, same thing. They're part of the CP4P, they're a partner of ours, does the outreach for Precious Blood. So these organizations are working together for the first time. They've always worked together, but this time we don't have to compete for dollars necessarily. And that has to become, it can't be all on the shoulders of the private funders. It has to be government money. We have to sink some money into these areas to really create a difference, a sustainable difference. And that's the other piece of this thing. We can't take our eye off the ball when the numbers start to come down. We have to sustain these efforts because they do work, the relationship work. I know Kobe House is here. I work for Kobe House as the jail ministry as well. And they have a table out here, Mary Claire is here, and some of the other partners are here. So there's information outside of the tables as well. So collar them, get them, help them understand, how you might be able to help, and also read the material that's out there. I'm going to turn this over to Colleen, right? One more question.
One thing that we haven't gotten into, and there's probably not really time for it, is education, basic education. And I know I have concerns about all the schools that the Catholic Church has closed, all the schools that the city closed. And these are things in the neighborhoods. And I understand you can't run a school without money, but that is really the initial piece for starting real nonviolence, is for a good basic education.
Anybody else have a question?
I heard you all just talk about interventions at the individual level, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, traumas that people have experienced, and also at the community level, disinvestment is being rectified, job investment, education, as the other audience member mentioned. But I'm wondering, and thinking of Father Kelly's remark right now, sustainable change moving forward into the future. What do you see around us, and what do you see as a necessity in terms of the family unit? Do you see working that's the bridge between individual and community, and also, I think, as basic as the other lady mentioned about education, do you see interventions being done about family life, family relationships that engender nonviolence and better interpersonal understandings?
Yeah, I would say a lot of that work is being done around securing the families, around housing. That's been a big proponent that we've seen. 18 to 24 in Chicago, large population due to high rates of homelessness or disconnected from their families, living in other places. It's something that's been, it's a huge part of the CP4P work, but also a huge part of our larger community intervention. We found over the years of doing the work that the women in the lives of these individuals and their mothers are really critical and key to the success. So you'll see a lot of kind of broader intervention around wraparound services, behavioral health, bringing the families into those spaces. And from that kind of work, we launched our pilot women's program last year. The girlfriends and the cousins and aunties and mothers of the participants in our programs to start them on the education track, get them back plugged in, and really start doing some construction management courses. So we're expanding that from 15 to 55 this year with working with the city colleges, 2 city colleges. And so again, a lot of this work is really springing us to think about the family in that way.
I think same regard, Precious Blood is really concentrating more and more on families and realizing the family, that unit, if that's a healthy unit, then we are better able to serve the young people because they go home to a safe environment. So that's hugely important. I think a lot of our organizations are starting to realize that maybe we started with work with a young person who's coming home from jail or prison or out on the streets, but we quickly recognize unless we really work with the families and give them the structure and the support and care that they so well deserve, that just ripples out across the community.
And when you speak of education, let's face it, that violence is a learned skill. When I was trained as a crisis negotiator, it was was weeks and hours of role play. When I learned to use a firearm for the FBI, that was training. This is a learned, trained skill, and often it starts in the family unit. Domestic violence is the precursor of many other forms of violence. Mass violence, school shooting, street violence often starts at home, and we've got to address that very early on. And that's some of that is getting over the stigma that we're going to talk about it, but also being non-judgmental when somebody raises those issues, being able to recognize those signs, being trauma-informed and seeing behavior as potentially being trauma-inflicted. And not saying, well, if we could just get this kid out of the class, whether it's a public school or even in our Catholic schools, we tend to think that we've got this down we've got discipline. So if we could just get these bad apples out of our schools, that classroom would be great. Well, I'll tell you what, we would have nobody in the classroom if we get rid of every bad apple in the classroom. We are not embracing our faith tradition in nonviolence. And we need to teach it, we need to train it, we need to practice it at every level. At every level, in the family, in our formation as Christians, and at any faith level, it's central to it. But I think that we focused a little more at this time around identification, like that we are something, as opposed to how is it that you live out that. And that is a learnable, trainable, but it requires significant investment in doing that. So I think you're right to bring up education. It is critical, but it starts at every aspect.